the work itself of being with people who were very sick, who were needed a lot, who often had really complicated situations in life, that work was complicated in many ways, but it was a very, it was like had a essence essence of ecstasy as well as terrible sadness. So you had this incredible range of emotion that was available to you. And not everybody likes that, but personally, you have such access to joy and access to sadness. So you would sort of hold both, but it's all around. It's an environment that's very rich in all of the meanings of that word. My first understanding and first awareness about HIV happened when I was still at the Pike Market Clinic, and the earliest diagnoses were made. You read about it nationally, then you heard about a case locally, and fairly soon at Pike, because we were a small clinic that was staffed by internists who were used to dealing with people with complex and multiple problems, unlike folks who might have been working in a clinic where you saw all kids and families all the time. We had a population of people who were older, but the docs were well positioned to be the right kind of docs. The person I knew who was a doc at one of the clinics became sick, and then you would know more and more people who became sick and died. And at that point, I had gone to work at Group Health. There was actually a lot of work to be done inside of Group Health, even though Group Health was never a major epicenter. It was not the center of and much of HIV in the community. It still had lots of things to do. And it allowed me to continue to work on issues, because all you had to do is raise your hand and say, I'm interested, to show up, which is sort of I think it's one of those things that's happened to me a lot, which is if you just raise your hand and say you want to do something, you usually can find a way. Someplace along the line, I can remember talking to a colleague who said, I was just talking about HIV and just the sort of burgeoning horror show of AIDS. And I said to my colleague, who was sort of pretty much looking clueless, talking about AIDS, I said, how can you not be engaged in this issue? How can you, as a person involved in public health in any way, not look at this as the most significant thing going on in the world? And he said, I don't know, actually. But, and I said, if I could find a job, if I could see a job that I could do in AIDS directly, I'd do it. A couple of years later, somebody called me up out of the blue and asked me if I would apply for a job. And the job turned out to be the job to open Bailey-Boushay. But the early services planning started in '87, and actually that's when the early planning happened through the health department with the partnership of what then was the Northwest AIDS Foundation, and then led to other services being developed. So when Pocan was being born, Chicken Soup was being born at those things at that time. The long-term care planning grew. It involved a massive community planning process, amazingly inclusive in terms of bringing in all the formal players in the healthcare system and all the informal players of the world affected by HIV. People living with AIDS, people caring for them as volunteers, people serving them in all kinds of settings, insurance providers, DSHS from the state, big hospitals units, big hospital providers, and other care providers like the visiting nurse, all at the table to talk about how to do it. At that point, people are dying in the hospital, which was by every measure a total disaster. It was inhumane. These were the days when, like in the bad movies, you see people were afraid to touch people who had AIDS. They wouldn't deliver your food tray, they'd leave it outside. Families were shamed by caregivers in hospitals. Patients living with AIDS and dying with AIDS were isolated and left by themselves. And it was a massive waste of, well, just on a very practical level, it was a massive waste of hospital resources and a terrible quality of life for people living with AIDS and dying of AIDS and their families and loved ones. And there was an understanding that the hospital was the wrong place, but there was no right place to get as much supportive nursing services, intensive nursing services as you can get. Normal nursing homes have very little nurse. Nurse is a name, but there are not very many nurses in nursing homes. And so there was a decision to build a new facility, which was a big deal. It took a blessing by the state. The state had to adopt a plan for development of a care facility for people with AIDS, and that was actually accomplished. Bailey-Boushay required unbelievable amount of political capital to be expended, and it took every bit of that muscle to get it through. Plans were drawn, permits were given, lawsuits were fought with the neighbors. Lots of things happened before there was a name. It was called the facility. They raised millions of dollars for the facility. And it was because they were sort of hoping, in the traditional way of running a capital campaign, that a big donor would come along and plunk down their $1 million and they'd name it after him. But no one ever did. The largest gift that came to Bailey-Boushay was $100,000, and it was anonymous. There weren't people to name it after, which was in some ways reflective. You know, I did have some friends who actually had a plot to raise a lot of money and give the money to what became Bailey-Boushay and name it after their father, who was a horrible bigot, but name it after their father. Because it would torment him. They were looking, literally, there's a book of names that are like generic housing development names, like Madison Home. You know, let's name it after the street. Let's name it after the neighborhood. Let's name it, you know, Rolling Ridge or something. I mean, just really innocuous. And they rejected that, and they finally, AIDS Housing Board decided that they would want the name. They offered the naming rights if we didn't sell them, but they offered the name to have it named in Thatcher Bailey's honor, because Thatcher had been such a stalwart fundraiser. Endless work to raise money for Bailey-Boushay. And he refused to have the building named after himself because he's that kind of a person. He's just too humble of a guy. And finally, after being hounded for quite some time, he consented if the building would be named after himself and Frank Boushay. And it was only adding Frank's name that Thatcher allowed it to happen. And that's where the name came from. Some days you could just stand back and say, the access to experience with others such joy and such laughter, as well as such incredible, wrenching sadness, is a gift. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's very few gifts that are as meaningful as to be present when someone dies. That was not my job at Bailey-Boushay, but it was the job of many people who worked there. And that gift is really a significant one to give and to receive. What you would find is there'd be somebody who'd have had a friend at Bailey-Boushay who died at Bailey-Boushay who would come and say, you know, when this facility was being planned, I was against it. And this is the best place in the world. And I'm sorry. So the relationship has been unbelievably positive, and that's just because the place is really beautifully run, and you know, the engagement with the community has been positive. But I inherited a lot of really great work that was done by AIDS Housing in terms of conversations with the community about how it might work. But in the end, people wait to see how it goes, and it's been a very positive experience.